Just a few days ago, I got a request from a seminary student asking if I would be willing to look over a sermon before she submitted it to her professor. I said I would be happy to, and I pictured a neatly typed manuscript with nice wide margins so I could make some suggestions, Like this section would be strengthened if you would quote directly from the biblical text, or here near the end, what if you stopped the sermon at this point instead of later on as you do? You see what I'm talking about. But it made me wonder what would happen if Jesus had submitted his sermon for my evaluation. What would I have written in the margins of the Sermon on the Mount? Probably something like this. Jesus, I love the force of your preaching, but when you say that those people who call their brothers and sisters fools are bound for hell, don't you think that's a little too strong? Isn't there a way you could soften that up just a bit? And when you say down here that adultery is wrong, I agree. I agree with you that we shouldn't lust. But do you really think gouging out one's eye is the best way to overcome that problem? Don't you think it might be worse somehow, even than the initial offense? And finally, Jesus, if you were preaching this particular sermon at Richmond's First Baptist Church, I might suggest that you leave out the part about divorce and remarriage, because we have a very successful divorce recovery workshop here. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people have gone through it, and your words, no matter how well intended, would prove to be offensive. Can you see that if Jesus had asked me to edit the Sermon on the Mount, it wouldn't be what it is? It might be less offensive, but it would also be less of almost everything else. What we have here is Jesus at his most passionate, his heart speaking to our hearts. He is telling us the truth, and if it hurts to hear it at points, we might acknowledge this is also the truth that can help and heal, the kind of truth that might eventually set us free. And so I'd like to leave the Sermon on the Mount just the way it is, in its unedited form. But at the bottom of the page, I might ask this question: Jesus, what are you trying to accomplish in this sermon? What are you trying to do? Because it seemed obvious to anyone who heard it, even in those days, Jesus was up to something. There were those who thought he was trying to abolish the law and the prophets. He says so in Matthew 5:17. Don't think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. Somebody must have been thinking that. Must have been thinking that he was announcing a revolution. Let's just tear up the old laws and make some new ones. Let's pick up clubs and pitchforks and go to Jerusalem. Let's throw out the old government and start something brand new. There were those who must have guessed that's what he was up to. But he wasn't. There were some who thought maybe he was trying to strengthen the old law, to firm up its sagging commandments, to make it even more rigid than it had been before. Didn't Jesus say that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven? What does exceeding righteousness look like, if not more rigid, more firmly established than even the old law? Maybe Jesus was trying to do that. But Jesus himself says, I haven't come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have come to fill them full. To fill the old law full of fresh meaning. That's what I've come to do. When I talk to people about Old Testament law, I often describe it as community-making literature. I say that when God brought his people out of Egypt, when he delivered them from slavery, took them through the Red Sea, and met them at Mount Sinai, he made his covenant with them. He said, I'm the God who brought you out of slavery. If you will be my people, I will be your God. And they all said, yes. And then God laid out the terms of that covenant. He said, first of all, you should have no other gods before me. And secondly, you should make no idols for yourselves. Don't take my name in vain, and remember my day, the Sabbath, and keep it holy. And then he talked about the relationships they would have among each other. Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land. Don't kill each other. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal from one another. Don't bear false witness about your neighbor. Don't covet your neighbor's possessions. All of these were the terms of the covenant, and in each of these rules, God was trying to create a certain kind of community. A community where people loved Him and loved others. In fact, Jesus would say later that the entire law was summed up in these two commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor just as much as yourself. Because if you did that, if you loved God with everything in you, then you would have no other gods but Him. You would make no idols and bow down to nothing else. You would speak His name like the name of the one you loved most, and His day would be precious to you, like a weekly wedding anniversary, signifying that covenant you had made with your beloved. If we really loved our neighbors as ourselves, we wouldn't have to have these other rules either. You certainly wouldn't murder someone you loved, would you? You wouldn't sleep with your neighbor's wife. You wouldn't steal from someone you loved. You wouldn't bear false witness about them. You wouldn't covet their things. You would be glad they had them. Jesus would say the whole law is filled up, fulfilled in the law of love. If we love God with everything in us, love our neighbors as ourselves, there will be no need for any other law. The law is fulfilled in love. But when there is no love, we tend to make laws. And that's what happened for God's people through the years. They began to make more and more laws as they felt less and less love. By the time Jesus was teaching and preaching, there were 613 rules God's people were meant to follow. 613 of them. Things had gone badly wrong and did not match God's original intention. And Jesus knew then and there something had to be done. They somehow had to start over again. And so He led people up onto a mountainside, just like Moses, and began to give them a new law, the law fulfilled in love. One of my favorite quotes is from Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann, who says, "The central task of ministry is the formation of a community with an alternative, liberated imagination that has the courage and the freedom to act in a different vision and a different perception of reality." Whatever else Jesus was doing in the Sermon on the Mount, He was doing that. He was forming a community. He didn't call it the kingdom of Israel. He called it the kingdom of heaven. And in this sermon, He lays down the law for this new community He is forming. He says, "You have heard that it was said in ancient times, 'You shall not murder.' And that may be fine for those people then and there, but I'm calling you to something higher than that, something better than that. I don't want you, my disciples, to even be angry with each other. Whoever is angry with his brother is liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother or sister is liable to the council, and whoever calls his brother or sister a fool is liable to the hell of fire." Jesus wants us to know that in His new community, in this kingdom of heaven that He's calling together, it's not okay to be angry with each other. We might get angry, but we can't stay angry. We cannot harbor anger in our hearts. We have to pluck up that seed before it takes root. I was talking about this in community missions last Wednesday, and somebody spoke up with a good question. How do you do that? How do you pluck up the seed of anger before it takes root? I didn't know the answer on Wednesday, but Jesus gives us an answer right here in the text. He says, if you come to church with your offering and you're getting ready to put it in the plate, and at that moment you remember that somebody has something against you, stop what you're doing. Leave the building. Go and find that person and make peace with him. And then come back and make your offering. Do you see what he says? This is the way you pluck up the seed of anger. You go and make peace with the one who has offended you. And you do it quickly before the seed can take root. In this passage, Jesus says, if your brother has something against you, go and make peace. And not just the other way around. We're pretty good at remembering everybody we have something against, but not as good at remembering everyone who has something against us. And when I heard someone teach on this passage years ago, I had to stop and think, is there anyone out there, anyone who has something against me? Well, there were probably lots of people, but I did remember one, an old girlfriend I had treated badly. And I went home and wrote a letter to her, a long letter. Please forgive me for what I did. I sent it. I never heard back, but I hope she got the letter. And I know this, that when I went to church the next time, my heart felt a little lighter. I felt a little more free for having done the kind of thing Jesus asked us to do.